Trier prides itself with being Germany's oldest continuously inhabited city, founded only a decade into Augustus' reign as Roman Emperor. The first 4 episodes in this series provided some context leading up to Trier's foundation. The time has now come to dive into the nitty-gritty of Roman construction in Trier itself. My name is Christian, and you're watching episode 5 of Romans on the Moselle.
The monumental stone buildings of the Romans were sturdy enough to survive the elements for many centuries. Yet we can consider ourselves lucky for the few that remain intact in Trier today. The many that have disappeared didn't just wither away, but were deliberately destroyed by Germanic and Viking invaders, and/or dismantled for their stones to be reused for other purposes in the Middle Ages. The buildings that have survived were often spared as a result of being given new purpose and meaning by the city's post-Roman masters. They now stand isolated from each other, bereft of their original context and meaning. And so when we walk among these still magnificent structures today, it can be a challenge to imagine what they originally stood for. In this respect, the exhibitions at Trier's main historical museum, the Rheinisches Landesmuseum, are very helpful. Alongside a wealth of archaeological findings on display here, there is also a complete miniature model of Roman Trier, which places the surviving buildings in their original setting. This model, designed by Joachim Voditsch, has been updated from time to time to reflect new archaeological discoveries.
The Trier of this model is a snapshot of what it might have looked like towards the end of the 4th century CE, following 400 years of continuous growth. But to understand how we ended up here, we need to take a couple of steps back and go back to its founding decades and then work ourselves forward from there through its different evolutionary stages. And what we will discover is that just like the Roman Empire at large, Trier was a very different place in its first 200 years compared to what it became in late antiquity.
A helpful guide for this journey is this book by Lambert Dahm, still in print, which contains a wealth of illustrations of Roman buildings in Trier as they evolved through time. In the years that preceded Trier's founding, there was for a short period a Roman military camp on the Tetrisberg Hills, which overlooked Trier from the east. The camp was quite large, capable of housing 2 legions. The military presence has been dated to 30 BCE, which suggests that it was linked to the suppression of the Treveri uprising at the time. The Treveri had exploited the Romans' preoccupation with their own civil war to try to break free from Roman rule. But this was soon suppressed by the Romans, and the military camp on Tetrisberg seems to have been dismantled not long thereafter. It would take another decade until Trier was officially founded by Augustus. This event, although not officially recognized in surviving written records, is believed to have occurred at or around the year 17 BCE, which is when Trier's first Roman bridge over the Moselle was built. This very precise dating of the first bridge was possible thanks to dendrochronology, a technique based on interpreting the pattern of tree rings in pieces of wood. Tree rings become wider in wet years when trees grow more and narrower in dry years. And this generates a unique pattern which can then be used to date very precisely the birth of major pieces of surviving wood. In the case of the Trier Bridge, some of the original wooden posts were preserved in the mud at the bottom of the Moselle River. The founding of Trier was not an organic natural event. It was meticulously planned by the Romans. We see this in the fact that one of the very first activities of the Romans was to put in place a rectangular street grid upon which the city would then be built. This was made easier by the limited presence of pre-existing Celtic settlement here. At first, the street grid was put in place in the form of provisional gravel roads with side gutters. Only decades later would they then be reinforced with a proper substructure and stone paving. The street grid provided the basis for so-called insulae, city blocks within which housing construction could proceed in an orderly manner. At first, Treviri settlers in this new city would continue to build the same kind of wood and clay-walled houses that we saw at their oppidum on Titelberg. Houses built on stone foundations would only emerge in the second half of the 1st century, as the city's population continued to grow. That Trier was growing steadily in the 1st century is evidenced in part by an increase in cremation graves on the outskirts of the city along its northern access road.
Trier was thus from the outset intended to be shaped into a prominent Roman city, with its associated monumentalism, and alongside the growth in private housing, several buildings of a public nature have been dated to the 1st century CE.
One of the earliest, interestingly, is the circus. This was the horse-chariot racetrack, in Greek known as a hippodrome. It was located to the city's eastern fringe. Note, however, that the monumentalist architecture we see here only emerged in the late 3rd and 4th centuries when Trier was the residence of Roman emperors. Its 1st century origins were much more rudimentary. There is almost no visible trace of the hippodrome today. It was dismantled in the Middle Ages and then completely overbuilt by the city in the modern era. Another 1st century addition to public infrastructure in Trier was the Forum. Staking out the Forum early on was a good idea given its large size and central location. Otherwise, private residences might occupy its space. It was huge, covering 6 city blocks. This was the heart of the Roman city. Its large open space allowing for big crowds during major political events, public announcements and religious festivals. It housed around its periphery many shops and stalls where daily goods were sold, thus also making it the commercial center of the city. In the following centuries, the Forum would also be further enlarged and embellished, ultimately ending up looking something like this 4th century model. An important meeting place for the Trier residents were the public baths. Perhaps more than anything, dressing and bathing like a Roman was an effective way for the Trier residents to demonstrate their Romanization and urban status. The first of several such facilities was the Forum baths, built towards the end of the 1st century, early 2nd century. Today it is also known as the baths by the cattle market, named so after the location's medieval function. The extensive excavated foundations have been given their own dedicated museum. The Treviri worshipped their own deities both before and after the arrival of the Romans, who did not suppress these Celtic beliefs. Instead, their gods were loosely associated with equivalents in the Greco-Roman pantheon. The chief deity of the Treviri was called Lenus, the Celtic god of healing, good fortune, and protection in battle. The Romans felt that their own war god Mars was a fitting enough equivalent. Overlooking the Moselle Valley on the western bank, there was already in pre-Roman times a sacred spring with special healing powers. In the 1st century of Roman rule, the temple of Lenus Mars was built just below this spring as a walled sacred precinct. This was then expanded into a magnificent temple in the 2nd century, adding a giant staircase and living quarters and bathing facilities for staff and guests. A sort of religious spa resort. A separate temple district emerged at Altbachtal, in the southeast corner of the city, also in the 1st century. It was a sprawling area that over time came to house a mix of smaller and larger Gallo-Roman temples, smaller shrines, altars, and even a small cult theater. The temples were mostly devoted to various Treveri Roman deities, initially built out of wood, only later to be replaced by more durable stone structures. One form of Gallo-Roman temple that we find here is of the ambulatory type. It has a covered walkway that goes all around the building. These did not exist in Rome. The design was uniquely Gallo-Roman and is believed to be an elaboration of traditional Celtic sanctuaries. In late antiquity, a temple to the eastern sun god Mithras was also erected here, but soon thereafter the entire temple district was razed by the Christian bishop and then overbuilt by a residential quarter. Just to the east of this temple district, a larger Gallo-Roman temple has been uncovered at Herrenbrechen. This is of a more traditional Roman design, similar to the one still in place today, for instance in Vienne in the south of France. It has steps that lead up to an elevated columned portico, behind which is the cella, which would typically contain a statue of the deity to which the temple is dedicated. Unfortunately, it is not known which god this temple was for, but the depiction of a snake on one of the findings suggests the possibility of a spring sanctuary. There is also indication that the Herrenbrechen spring was an important source of fresh water for Trier in the 1st century. Later on, tradition has it that the first Christian baptisms were conducted at this spring in the 3rd century. Another late 1st century temple was discovered during the construction of an underground parking garage near the banks of the Moselle in the 1970s. Unlike the Herrenbrechen temple, this one was surrounded by a large colonnaded courtyard. An inscription found nearby suggests that it may have been dedicated to the Greek healing god Asclepius, although some historians have questioned whether this inscription was really related to the temple. Another possibility would be that the temple was dedicated to the Capitoline Triad, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. These 3 gods were the protectors of the Roman Empire, and their worship was a public political act, reinforcing devotion to the empire. Following the example of Rome, all major Roman cities would have such a temple somewhere. In the case of Trier, archaeologists have not been able to find evidence of such a temple near the Forum, which would be its most common location.
In the 2nd century CE, Trier enjoyed, like the rest of the Roman Empire, a prolonged period of relative peace and prosperity. Wall decorations and mosaics in private residences became increasingly elaborate, pointing to the growing wealth of the Treveri elites during this period. And the city continued to grow, with several major additions being made to the urban landscape.
This included Trier's city wall, dated to around 170 CE, along with its 4 enormous city gates, situated at each of its 4 main entry points. It's worth noting here that, at the time of the city wall's construction, Trier was not particularly threatened. We can therefore conclude that the wall was built as much as a symbol of Trier's prominence as a Roman city as for any immediate defensive benefit. The enormous gate served to impress any visitor now approaching the city by road. One of these gates, the Porta Nigra to the north, still stands largely intact today, thanks to having been converted into a church in the Middle Ages. The other 3 gates, however, along with the wall itself, were ultimately dismantled and their stones reused for other purposes, including the construction of a much smaller city wall in the Middle Ages, at a time when the city no longer had the manpower to defend the full length of the Roman wall. In the 2nd century, Trier also got its own amphitheater, which was integrated with the city wall. During large events, when thousands of visitors would congregate in the amphitheater, they could enter it both from within the city and from the outside. Thanks to having been situated on the hills on the edge of the city, the amphitheater was never built over or fully destroyed. It has been thoroughly excavated in modern times, and the underground tunnels used to provide access to the amphitheater for animals and gladiators have been restored and made safely accessible for modern visitors. But what about regular theaters or festivals, music and plays? Surprisingly, no trace of a theater has yet been found in the city center, although that doesn't prove it didn't exist. But one very large theater has been located outside the city walls next to the temple of Lenus Mars across the river. Only the stage foundation of this theater has been uncovered, while the seating area was apparently robbed of its stones and reused in the Middle Ages. Placing theaters in religious cult areas is consistent with the theatrical performances of cult myths, which were often an ingredient in religious festivals. And a high-capacity theater allowed for an organized gathering of large crowds of people during such religious festivals. By the 2nd century, the city had outgrown its rather modest foreign bath facility. Now a more elaborate public bath was built in a strategic location on the eastern bank of the Moselle. The imposing front of the Barbara Baths was visible from across the river by visitors approaching the Trier Bridge from the south. These new monumental baths were exquisitely decorated inside and out, no expense spared, with white marble wall cladding, beautiful statues and wall art made available through Trier's trade integration with the rest of the Roman world. Trier was putting its Romanesque on public display.
Although we cannot establish the size of Trier's population with any great precision, the size of major installations, such as the Barbara Baths, the amphitheater and the city wall, are all suggestive of a city population that by now counted in the tens of thousands.
Population growth and the addition of the larger Barbara Baths meant that the existing local water sources were no longer able to meet the city's needs. And so now an aqueduct was constructed from the river Ruver, a tributary flowing into the Moselle just to the northeast of Trier. Unlike the Moselle, the Ruver flows just high enough above the city to allow gravity to do the job of transporting water through pipes into the city. It's an impressive piece of engineering. 13 kilometers in length, it was buried underground to protect it from damage and from freezing. And it had an extremely shallow gradient, falling only 8 meters over its entire length.
In a sense, it's appropriate to speak of two Roman Triers. The first one peaked towards the end of the 2nd century. And although it was important for the administration of Gallia Belgica, it was never really the seat of the emperors themselves, and most of the construction was financed and undertaken by the Romanized Treverian themselves. This first era of prosperity was followed by the turmoil of the 3rd century, when Trier for a while became the seat of the breakaway Gallic Empire. Not that much of great importance was built in Trier during this period. And then came the attacks of the Germanic Alemanni from across the Rhine in 275, causing great havoc. The second Roman Trier 2.0, if you will, rose out of the ashes of this Germanic destruction to become the seat of several emperors in the 4th century. The Romans had learned from the experience of the crisis of the 3rd century that Gaul needed a more permanent presence of an emperor to keep the peace. And with Trier now being the residence of emperors on a semi-permanent basis, needed to be spruced up to an entirely new level of Roman monumentalism.
A major 4th century addition was the Imperial Baths, built on a site where up to that point prominent Treveri residences had been situated. Because of its ambitious scale, the Imperial Baths would take a long time to complete, And in fact they never were, at least not as originally intended. Emperor Constantine got caught up in a Roman civil war, bringing construction to a standstill when the baths were only in the early stages. By the time the project was resumed, half a century later, the turbulent times no longer called for a fancy bathing complex. Instead, the structure was repurposed and completed as a palace and barracks for the imperial cavalry. Only a small private bathing facility within this new structure was ever put to use as it was originally intended. Once Emperor Constantine had vanquished his main rival at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312, he would resume Trier's ambitious building program, but taking it in a new direction. As an imperial benefactor of Christianity, Constantine supported the city's bishop in the construction of Trier's first church, in the very same place where today we find the town's magnificent Romanesque cathedral. The first structure was a modest church modeled on the traditional Roman basilica. Using the Roman basilica as template for early Christian churches reflected both practical and symbolic preferences. Its large open space was suitable for the congregation of Christian believers. It also made a statement in its stark deviation from traditional Roman temple design. Over the course of the 4th century, 3 more buildings were added to this first church, creating a huge Christian complex shown in this model, located in Trier's Cathedral Museum. Unfortunately, it all burned down during Germanic and Hunnic invasions of the 5th century, then partly rebuilt again soon thereafter, only to be destroyed once more by Viking raiders in the 9th century. But even today, if you look carefully at the northern wall of the cathedral, you can still see the window arches from the late antique church. And if you sign up for one of the guided tours on offer at the cathedral, you can also visit the underground foundations of the very first Roman church. Both a tour and a visit to the delightful Cathedral Museum are essential for imagining Trier's long-lost original Christian church. One of the most impressive surviving Roman buildings from this era is the Basilica of Constantine. Now, despite its popular name, this one was not originally built to function as a church, but was a center for law courts, business, government administration, and public meetings. It was, in essence, the emperor's reception hall. The basilica was only one element in a much larger imperial palace complex, the design of which was partly uncovered in excavations in the 1980s, once again in preparation for the building of a large underground parking garage. The construction on the basilica and the palace began early in the 4th century, but would only be completed several decades later. Taken together, the church, the remodeled imperial baths, the monumentalized circus of the 4th century, the basilica and its other palace buildings, with a large palace garden in between, appear to have made up a meticulously planned palace district for the emperor and the imperial administration of the late 4th century. This is still an area of active archaeological research, and parts of this palace district remain hidden underground. Thus we need to apply a bit of imagination when we visit the surviving Roman buildings in Trier today, to perceive them in their wider original context. They may look isolated today, scattered as they are across the modern city, but in Roman times they were lined up with each other as part of a coherent and very much planned urban imperial design. Just for completeness, there was an earlier palace located just west of the Forum. It was a magnificent complex with assembly halls, courtyards, colonnades and fountains, marble cladding, murals and mosaics. Importantly, this palace precedes the time when emperors resided in Trier. We cannot say exactly when it was built, but it may well be that it saw its heyday in the 3rd century, when Trier for a few years was the shared capital of the breakaway Gallic Empire. There is a mosaic inscription that names the Praetorian tribune Victorinus as its patron. He was the short-lived successor to Postumus as the leader of the Gallic Empire. What became of this palace after Gaul was brought back into the Roman fold, we don't really know. But perhaps one can understand if the emperors that came to reside in Trier in the 4th century preferred to build something altogether new for themselves, rather than inheriting the palace of secessionist rebels.
Well, I hope you found this helpful, this map-based chronology of the history of Roman Trier over 400 years. Of course, we would need to come back and take a closer look at some of these buildings in dedicated episodes, including their architectural origins, their symbolism, their function. And not to forget residential construction in Trier, which we haven't covered much today, the domus, the insulae, the villa. Depending on your position in society, the quality of your lodgings could be quite varied. And I'll mix it up with some thematic episodes on the Roman administration of Trier and the Romanization of the Treviri. So we have some fun topics going forward to look forward to. But I think I'll say ciao for now, and I'll hope to see you soon again.